Our gospel reading this morning comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, verses 1 through 13. If you would like to follow along in your pew Bible, you can find it in the New Testament portion on page 40. He, meaning Jesus, left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded. They said, "Where did this man get all of this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. Then Jesus said to them, "Prophets are not without honor, except in their hometown, and among their own kin, and in their own house." And he could do no deed of power there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. And he was amazed at their unbelief. Then he went about among the villages teaching. He called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2, and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He ordered them to take nothing for their journey, except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not to put on 2 tunics. He said to them, "Wherever you enter a house, stay there until you leave the place. If any place will not welcome you and they refuse to hear you, as you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them." So they went out and proclaimed that all should repent. They cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and cured them. The word of the Lord. When I think about what Jesus might have been like, I have to admit that I am very tempted to think of him as always being happy, or at least peaceful. It's hard for me to think of Jesus as ever having been disappointed, or angry, or having his feelings hurt. It's hard for me to even think of Jesus as having a bad day, or what he considered would be a bad day. Even when he was on his journey to the cross and things were very bad, it's hard for me to think of him as being scared or anxious. Somehow it just seems easier for me to think of Jesus as just being obedient and resigned to that fate. Some of this I'm going to blame on Hollywood. Almost every popular Jesus miniseries or big motion picture has Jesus quietly taking whatever it is that we can dish out, with a pleasantness of character. The one exception is, of course, when Jesus overturns the money changers' tables in the temple. But even with that, the Hollywood Jesus quickly returns to his pleasant disposition, teaching people, showing kindness, and looking like a sweet and kind person, never again raising his voice or becoming frustrated. But I can't just blame Hollywood for my distorted vision of Jesus. If I'm honest, then I must admit that some of the reason I have a hard time picturing Jesus having a bad day is the church's fault, too. My childhood Sunday school classes always presented Jesus as an even-keeled kind of guy. I don't ever recall having even considered how Jesus must have felt, or that he might have cried on some days, or just felt off on other days, or that he might have once in a while gotten up on the wrong side of the bed. That thought just never crossed my mind before. We proclaim all of the time that Jesus is fully human and fully divine, but I'm not so sure we do such a great job of admitting that being fully human means sometimes having what I like to call the mully grubs, or a bad hair day, or a day when you just want to go back to bed, a day when you feel as though you can't do anything right, or a day even when you feel hemmed in by our surroundings and limited in our power to make any kind of difference in the world. But this morning's reading in the gospel has me rethinking things. In Mark chapter 6, Jesus goes home. Now, things move very fast in the Gospel of Mark, and events seem to pile upon each other quickly. You can almost feel how hectic it is as you read it. There are comings and goings throughout this gospel. They're on one side of the sea, and then they cross to the other, and then they decide to get back in the boat and go again. There are crowds and people everywhere. They are pushing and pulling. Mark often expresses urgency, telling us Jesus did something immediately or at once. There are people who interrupt the flow of things and seem to add just one more thing to Jesus's already full plate. It's only chapter 6, and yet Mark presents Jesus here as a fully grown man. He's already been baptized. He's already called the disciples. He has proclaimed the good news. He taught with authority. He exorcised unclean spirits. He healed the sick. He healed the lame. He caused a good bit of trouble for himself among the religious leaders. He stated his lordship over the Sabbath, redefined who constitutes a family. He calmed the wind and the sea. He brought outsiders in and raised a child from apparent death. And he also had spent deliberate time teaching his disciples. It's safe to say that Jesus has been pretty busy in the Gospel of Mark. And now he finally gets a chance to go home, a place where he'd probably like to sit down and put his feet up, enjoy the quiet, non-crowded city, maybe have a glass of wine, see the people who love him, catch up with his siblings, recharge his battery a bit. He was probably looking forward to visiting home. And then he got there. I think we must all have some idea of what this feels like. I know I do. For me, it's when there's been a very hectic week at work, and out of the pile of things that I needed to do on my desk, only a handful of them got done. And before I'm even able to make it through the garage door, my children are lining up to tell me whose fault it is that one of them is crying. And by the way, the dog got sick in the middle of the carpet, and it's been there all day because it was too disgusting for any of us to clean up. And we're hungry, and there's nothing to eat, even though I did go to the grocery store yesterday. And remember, Mom, I have tutoring at 6. Oh, and I forgot to tell you I need black stockings for my choir performance tomorrow. And can so-and-so come over? Oh, and Dad called, and he said he's going to be late from work. And while all this is going on, the phone is ringing, but no one can find the handset. And I can vaguely recall that just a few moments before all of this is happening, all I had wanted to do was get home, change my clothes, sit in my favorite chair. And now all I can think about is getting back in that car and driving away as fast as I can. I hope that I'm not the only one who has days like that. When I do have a day like that, my ability to get even the smallest things accomplished is radically diminished by my disappointment. Suddenly, a hectic day can turn into a very bad day. But that's how a bad day happens for me. Does Mark mean to tell us that Jesus has bad days too? Is Jesus really just one of us? That seems to be the message that his hometown wants to convey to him. He may think that he's all that, but he's really just whatever he studied to be, just a carpenter. He's really just someone's son, just Mary's son. He's really just someone's sibling. He really is just one of us. And Jesus, he seems to agree with their assessment. He doesn't argue or insist on anything different. He doesn't set out to prove them wrong. He hasn't saved a big miracle up his sleeve for just such a time as this. You're right, he seems to agree. I am just one of you. I mean, if I were Jesus and I had just cured or just raised a little girl from the dead in the very last town I was in, I would be looking for a whole family to raise from the dead just so I could say, see, I showed you. But the reading tells us instead that Jesus could do no deed of power there. It wasn't that he didn't want to do a deed of power. The reading tells us he couldn't do a deed of power. Now, of course, it goes on to say he did lay his hands on a few sick people and cure them, but that's old hat stuff, and apparently does not count as a deed of power in the Gospel of Mark. But I think what Mark is trying to say is, the point is that Jesus he was affected. He was affected by what people said about him. He was affected by what people said to him. He was affected, maybe, by the fact that people doubted him and thought less of him. And could it be for even just a moment that Jesus might have believed what they were saying and therefore could do no deed of power there? He was just like one of us, amazed, rejected, put in his place, limited, vulnerable, broken. Think about that for a moment. Jesus was just like one of us, human, with all of the human emotions and constraints, just like one of us, and just like that, he could do no deeds of power there. Jesus failed. And he didn't just fail at doing a deed of power, he failed at being everything we expected him to be. He failed at not letting things bother him. He failed at having superhuman emotions that would allow him to go through his life without feelings of rejection or fear or anxiety. He failed at being able to do everything well all of the time. He failed at only seeing the best in people, even when they show us their very worst sides. He failed at being perfect. Jesus failed at all kinds of things in this story, but he succeeded in one very important thing. He succeeded in being human. In the book, 1,000,000 Miles in 1,000 Years, What I Learned While Editing My Life, author Donald Miller writes this sentence: When you stop expecting people to be perfect, you can like them for who they really are. So maybe what Mark is trying to tell us is that even while it might be uncomfortable and hard for us to picture Jesus as being this truly human and fallible person that he was, someone like us, perhaps it's necessary. Because then we can begin to like Jesus for who he really is. Only then can we truly appreciate what Jesus does next. See, he calls the 12, and he begins to send them out, 2 by 2. He gives them authority over the unclean spirits. He gives up control. He allows his friends in. He allows his friends to help. Jesus realizes that this message that he's carrying, this good news that needs to be proclaimed, is much bigger than just one person. And so he doesn't hold on for dear life and choose to go down with that ship, thinking he's the only one who can distribute help. He doesn't sit tight-lipped and proud, thinking he's the only one able to deliver the message. He doesn't say, it's either my deeds of power or no deeds of power. Instead, he calls together these unlikely people who are with him. A strange assortment, really, of fishermen and tax collectors and no telling what other kinds of tradesmen. People like us. People with no special skills or talents for casting out demons or healing the sick. People who had only been observers up to this point in Mark's story. And he empowers these ordinary people to go on the road and do what he has done. To proclaim good news. To cast out demons. And heal people, real suffering people. And he also empowers them to do something else. He empowers them to fail. If they had been worried about what would happen if they ventured out and flopped on their face, if they had been fearful that people might reject them or laugh at their message, if they had been wondering what people would say when they found out that they were just regular people, if they had been worried that they might fail to help people receive the good news and be healed, then Jesus had shown them already what to do. Rely on nothing. No things can help you with deeds of power. No bread, no money, no extra change of clothes. And while things might make us more comfortable, they do not help us proclaim news with power, nor do they help alleviate any feelings of rejection and failure. Instead, rely on each other. Go in twos. Take a friend who believes the same as you do with you. Don't depend upon the medium of the message. Depend upon the message. Depend upon each other. Nothing extra. Nothing. Jesus wanted his friends to understand that the only thing needed to share the gospel with others are people just like us. Amen.